Management of oil revenues also allowed Russia to emerge from the crisis with a low public debt ratio, around 7% of GDP, which is in contrast again to the European Union and the US, which showed much higher public debt ratios. And the economy wasn't even in a position to raise pensions through reforms in 2009, 2010, which is important for Russia because it has a large percentage of the population which is aging. So the next slide, please. It should show the size of discretionary measures in financial crisis as a percentage of GDP. Again, what I just said, Russia had the largest discretionary program of the BRICS. The other BRIC, particularly Brazil and India, did not spend very much as a percentage of its GDP in fighting the crisis, but China also had a very expressive discretionary program, comparable to those in the developed countries. Let's look at India. The Indian economy initially remained relatively insulated from the global economies, but it did suffer a slowdown in GDP growth from 7.5% in the first half to 6% in the second half of 2008. So it did slow down a bit, even though it managed to keep a quite significant and large economic growth rate. This was amplified by sharp contraction in the manufacturing sector performance, which was exposed to external demand shocks, excuse me, which led in turn to high unemployment and undermined domestic consumption demand. And this happened because most of the Indian manufacturing sector is labor intensive. And in particular, 42% of the Indian manufacturing exports are in the sectors of leather, textile, jams, and jewelry and handicrafts. And so the impact on employment was quite perverse. What were the policy responses? Well, initially the government tried to contain the contagion from the external markets within India, and it had three main objectives. First, maintain a comfortable rupee liquidity position, augment foreign exchange liquidity. Second, and third, to maintain a policy framework that would keep the credit delivery on track. And several particular measures were taken for those purposes. Three fiscal stimulus packages were implemented during the second half of 2008 and 2009, constituting of tax cuts, encouraging investment infrastructure, and increased expenditure on both investment and consumption. The expansionary fiscal stance continued in the Union budget for 2009-2010, and in particular, certain sectors such as infrastructure, education, and health, rural employment, and poverty alleviation were privileged and received considerably more funds. Additional expenditure amounting to 3% of GDP was provided through other supplementary demands for grants during late 2008 and early 2009. And the monetary policy response sought to ease liquidity through several measures, some of them conventional, such as open market operations, and other less conventional, such as the opening of refinance facilities and the Exim Bank. Let's look at China. And, you know, it may seem odd to say that China suffered from the crisis since it had a growth rate of over 9% in 2009. Still, the impact of the crisis on China took the form of a sharp drop in external demand, which in turn led to economic slowdown, difficulty for businesses, and rising unemployment. The rate of increase of industrial electricity consumption, which is an indicator of how the real economy is doing, fell sharply in 2008, and from May to October of 2008, the Shanghai Stock Exchange Composite Index dropped over 50%. From July 2008 to February 2009, the yuan's real effective exchange rate also rose dramatically by 14.5%, which negatively affected the country's exports. And as a result, during the second half of 2008, 15% of export firms were forced to reduce output or even to shut down. And then there were a number of proactive fiscal policies, measures to expand expansionary monetary policy measures, and a package plan to ensure steady and relatively fast economic growth, aiming to boost domestic demand. And in a sense, the crisis actually helped China because it helped the country to focus on a model of growth based on domestic demand, which is something it's still trying to do. Secondly, it tried to improve infrastructure across the country Third, to enhance industry's competitiveness and capacity for independent innovation. And governments, both at central and local levels, have expanded their expenditures, partly through the issuing of public bonds. The People's Bank of China also played a very significant role in fighting the crisis. It has conducted open market operations to ensure sufficient liquidity in the banking system in general and to stabilize market expectations. It has also lowered the benchmark for depositing and lending rates of several sorts and changed other rules regarding lending and credit to ease the credit, which I will not go into here for the sake of time, but I can talk more about later if there's interest. Well, finally, Brazil, which is, for obvious reasons, is the country I know the best, in which I will focus more here. The country actually was shot down as it was experiencing high rates of economic growth. It was taking off, but we saw local currency and stock market fluctuations of very large dimensions. If you remember, the real fell dramatically relatively to the dollar at the time, and the stock market plummeted. Demand for our commodities exports also dried up, and external credit was significantly decreased. And as a result, the path of economic growth that the country was trailing was interrupted, and Brazil had a slightly negative decrease or negative rate of economic growth in 2009. Also in 2009, Brazilian total foreign trade fell by over 24%, and this happened as a result mostly of the reduction in international prices of commodities, minerals, agricultural products, and the overall external demand for goods and services. But Brazil did recover quite well. It actually presented a V-shaped pattern of recovery, and after just 2 quarters of GDP slump. What were the policy responses? Well, they combined in general monetary easing, credit stimulus, and countercyclical fiscal policies, all of which had a quite positive impact on private consumption and propelled industrial growth. Rules concerning the reserve requirements were relaxed, and this resulted in the injection of additional liquidity equivalent 4% of the GDP. And in order to dispel fears concerning the soundness of the domestic banking sector, the central bank allowed the Fundo Garantidor de Crédito, which is a national private deposit insurance fund and a non-financial institution, it allowed it to guarantee bank deposit receipts with a cap. There were also initiatives to inject liquidity in foreign currency markets, and I'm not going to go into those either for the interest of time, but it is important to mention the role of the central bank in cutting the interest rates repeatedly to amount that totaled until July of 2009 5%, and in order to stimulate sales and production, also cut tax on manufactured goods, the IPI, on vehicles, household appliances, capital goods, and building construction materials. The tax on financial transactions, the EOF, also was reduced from 3% to 1.5%, and in addition, the public banks and state-owned banks played a very significant role. There were injections of the Treasury in the BNDES, the National Development Bank, and BNDES increased its loans to energy and infrastructure sectors and launched new credit facilities for exporters and for the production of capital and consumption goods. Could you pass, please? The next figure should show precisely the role of public credit in fighting the crisis in Brazil. The top curve refers precisely to public credit, where the next two refer respectively to national private and foreign private, which, as you can see, were much lower during the years of the crisis peak. The next one, please, should refer to international reserves. And we